So Clarice Beckett was an early 20th century painter. She lived in Melbourne and in fact studied at the National Gallery Victoria School from 1914 to 1916. She then studied with Max Meldrum and adopted many of his tonalist techniques. She took those outdoors and she really applied these techniques of tonalism, which were largely but not entirely studio-based. She applied these to the outdoor world and her capturing of atmospheric effects out in the landscape. So this exhibition, Clarice Beckett Atmosphere at Geelong Gallery, brings together a series of works painted outdoors and also in the studio, but of outdoor subjects, where she's really responding to atmosphere, to light, to reflections, to rain, to haze, etc. These wonderful fleeting moments that happen in the landscape. She was quite a well-known artist in her time, I guess you could say. She exhibited regularly in Melbourne at the Athenaeum Gallery. She had solo exhibitions from 1923 through to 1933 every year, where she produced or exhibited 60 to 80 works per year. So she was quite a prolific artist and very dedicated and very professional in the way that she saw her artistic practice. Sadly, she died in 1935, aged only 48. Of course, there was a memorial exhibition of her work staged the following year, but then she sort of fell into obscurity to a degree. A number of her works were taken to a barn outside Benalla and stored, and it wasn't until the 1970s, through a series of exhibitions staged by Rosalind Humphreys, now Pollingrake, really was at the forefront of bringing Clarice's works back to popular attention and public knowledge. So in the 1970s, Rosalind ran a gallery in Melbourne. She put a call out for work by female artists to be shown in her exhibition space, and that call out was responded to by Hilda Mangan, the sister of Clarice Beckett. And it's through that exchange that they had that Rosalind went out to the farm at Benalla with Hilda, and they discovered over 2,000 canvases that had been stored on site. Sadly, quite a few of them were beyond repair. They'd been exposed to weather conditions, to possums and rats, and they were beyond repair. But out of that 2,000 works, about 370 could be salvaged, and they became the foundation of what we now know of Clarice's practice as a whole. Additional to some of the works that have been collected by private collectors as well along the way. So it's a remarkable story of an artist coming back to popular imagination through the work of a curator and gallerist, Rosalind Humphreys. And there's very few stories like it in Australian art, I would argue, where an individual has been so intrinsically linked with the reclamation and the reappraisal of an artist's work. She studied at the National Gallery of Victoria School, as I mentioned, and there were a lot of female artists that studied at the NGV, primarily in the day classes. Social conditions suggested that they couldn't always go to night classes, and in fact, when Clarice expressed interest in studying at the National Gallery of Victoria School, she was permitted to do so. Even though she was in her late 20s by that stage, she was permitted to do so if only she went with her sister as chaperone. So there were some social conditions around her studies. But if we look at the roles of the National Gallery of School, the attendance roles, there were many, many artists that were working at the school. Some of them went on to professional practices, but in the early 20th century, not a lot of artists, or female artists, were thought to be professional artists. A lot of them were considered hobbyists, gentle practitioners. So it was mainly the male artists that were considered to be the professional artists. So in that sense, she was quite dedicated to her art practice, and she wanted to be an artist. She pursued it vigorously, and she obviously had a lot to say in her art practice. So in that sense, she had female colleagues that were painters, but predominantly she was working amidst men. She did develop a reputation as one of the best students at Max Meldrum School, but something that I reflect on often is that even in the 1950s, 20 years after Clarice died, Max Meldrum published his treatise on his theories on tonalism, called The Science of Appearances, and it was a massive book that he published in 1955. When you read that book in 1955, every reference to artist is male. So even 20 years after Clarice died, the way that Max Meldrum saw the world was singularly through the idea of a male artist. So you can only imagine that she was up against it to a degree as a female artist working at that time, but she was certainly a very dedicated practitioner. You're right, I think there's something about her works that seems to really connect with us universally. That doesn't happen by accident, I don't think, because there is such a response to her work and the way that she really captures the truth in nature, and that was her goal, to capture the truth in nature in her work. And I think she goes beyond that. I think she's able to capture an incredible mood within her work, to capture the fleeting effects of those atmospheric conditions that we experience out there, to translate them onto canvas. So the ideas around tonalism were very much about how do our eyes see a range of tones, and then how does an artist place those onto the canvas. And I think she achieved that incredibly successfully. One thing about particularly these works that I'm standing in front of, many of the nocturnes, in these later works in her practice, so most of them were done in the early 1930s, not long before she died in 1935. And through these works, I think she was really trying to capture a sense of mood, a sense of the evening. A couple of them are inspired or named after Whistler, the late 19th century American-British artist James Abbott McDill Whistler, who of course painted a series of nocturnes himself. And these were named after the fact that the works reminded his patron of the idea of Chopin's nocturnes, the way that classical music captures a mood. We don't listen to classical music necessarily and want to locate the place it was written or performed. We just engage with the mood that the piece conjures. And I think in many respects, Beckett's references to Whistler in these late works is very much about her goal to similarly create mood, to really capture on canvas not only a scene but the mood of evening, whether it's the melancholy wistfulness of evening, representing the end of the close of the day, the romance of evening, or whatever it might be. But she has really successfully captured this sense of mood, and I think that's what people are really responding to in her work. She was a prolific exhibitor, and she did receive coverage in the press of the day. So she had a number of her exhibitions referred to in Melbourne papers by a range of different critics, actually. So some of them were very positive and some not so positive. I think a lot of them grappled with the very progressive nature of her painting. It's very easy to forget that these paintings were painted over 100 years ago, and for their time they were quite radically different to the norm, the big panoramic, quite masculine landscapes of someone like Streeton, for example. He was a reviewer that criticised her work. He came around in good time, but she was criticised for the blurriness of her effect. Her still lifes were very well received, and remember that still life was often considered the domain of women, the very domestic setting, the small scale of a still life, etc. But it was her landscape, I think, that often was criticised. And of course, landscape has traditionally been a very masculine domain in Australian painting. So I think she had a bit of criticism and a bit of encouragement as well. There were some reviewers that were incredibly passionate about her work and were very keen supporters of her practice. So it was quite mixed.